In this lecture, we're going to talk about the female reproductive system. The primary structures of the female reproductive system include the ovary, which is what they call primary gonad. This is the main organ analogous to the testes in males. This is where egg cells, the gametes in females, are formed, and also where the female sex steroid hormones, estrogen and progesterone, are produced. And then in addition to the ovary, there are the ducts that carry the egg away from the ovary. So analogous to the sperm ducts, epididymis, ductus deferens, ejaculatory duct, and urethra, except that in the females, they're part of the duct system is highly modified, because the female, in addition to making gametes and hormones, is going to provide the site for development of the egg in the event that it becomes fertilized. In other words, the site for pregnancy. So the first duct, it does look like a duct. It's the uterine tube, also called the fallopian tube. And then that leads into the uterus, which is in this region in here. The uterus, it doesn't really look like a duct, but it does, the fallopian tube leads into it, and it does have a lumen. And if you follow it along, you reach the neck of the uterus, which is called the cervix, so that's part of the uterus. And then that leads into the third part, the vagina. So in females, there's three ducts, or modified ducts: the fallopian tube, the uterus with the cervix included, and the vagina. Okay, and then there are some external genitalia that we were going to look at that are homologous to the scrotum and penis in the male, and by that I mean they develop from the same tissues. So in females, there's the folds around where the vagina and the urethra open to the exterior, and those folds are called labia. And there's a smaller and a larger outer fold. So they talk about the labia minus or minor and the labia major or magus. So these folds of tissue here. There's pubic hair on the outside of the labia major. And then there is some erectile tissue called the clitoris, or some people say clitoris, which is homologous to, again, coming from the same tissue that forms the head of the penis, called the glans, penis, G-L-A-N-S. And if you recall, when we talked about the male reproductive system, we talked about erectile tissue that has spaces in it into which blood can flow and cause an erection. So the clitoris, like the penis, has that kind of tissue in it. So there's the two labia, the clitoris, and then there's this adipose-rich covering over where the two hip bones meet in the front. Remember the pubic symphysis? That whole region is called the mons pubis, and that is also considered in the female as part of the external genitalia. This is a cadaver picture of those organs. Mainly I wanted to show you this to show you the ovary. So it's not really that big. It's kind of the size of an olive here in the pelvic cavity. Unlike males, where remember the testes and ovaries come from the same tissue, so they start in the pelvic cavity. But then remember, in males, the testes have to descend outside the body into the scrotum. Ovaries do not descend. They do move inferiorly from where they first start forming in the embryo, but they do not descend out of the pelvic cavity. So there's the ovary. Here you see the uterus here. This would be the cervix region, and then into the vagina area. So in addition to just serving as ducts, again, the uterus is the site where the fertilized egg is going to develop. This is where the baby will gestate for 9 months. We'll look at that briefly in our last lecture. And then the vagina serves as sometimes referred to as the birth canal, because when the baby's ready to be born, if it's a natural childbirth, it's going to pass through the vagina. Also, the vagina is what receives the sperm during intercourse. Here's a different view, a posterior view of the reproductive system in females. So here we see the ovaries. And notice how they are anchored to the uterus by a ligament called the ovarian ligament here in white. And then looking on the other side of the ovary, here we see the beginning of the uterine tube, or most medical people use the term fallopian tube. You might also see it called the oviduct, O-V-I-D-U-C-T, but that's mostly biologists use that term. Anyway, the fallopian tube, look at it closely. Notice it does not physically, connect to the ovary. It comes very close to it. And then it has these finger-like extensions called fimbriae. And those fimbriae are going to help sweep the egg that's eventually going to be, eggs will be released from the ovary into the fallopian tube, and these fimbriae at that time are going to kind of move and kind of help sweep or suck the egg up into the fallopian tube. So here we see the uterine tube coming around and then leading into the uterus. Following the uterus down, we get to the cervix and then into the beginning of the vagina. So we will be talking primarily about ovaries, since they are the main organ in the female. And again, just to remind you that these two organs in males and females are homologous. Again, that means in this sense, when you're talking about embryological development, it means that they come from the same tissue in the early embryo. Here's a list of the organs in the female, divided up into the internal genitalia, which you cannot see externally, and the external genitalia. So for the internal genitalia, we have the primary gonad, the ovaries, the fallopian tube, uterus, vagina that we just talked about. Here are the external genitalia that we went over, the mons pubis covering the pubic symphysis, the two folds, major and minor labia, and the clitoris. And then also the mammary glands are considered part of the female reproductive system. They are a type of exocrine gland that produces, of course, milk for nursing purposes. So this slide has a lot of information in it. This is a slide of an ovary, a frontal section of the ovary, and if you look in here, you see many different structures. First off, you would never see all these structures at the same time in an ovary. So this is sort of like a time-lapsed view of the different structures that you would see in an ovary if you looked at different times. Now let's start from before puberty. And again, puberty just means when do the reproductive systems become functional, because they're there at birth, but they don't actually start producing eggs, or in the case of male, sperm and hormones, until puberty, the onset of the functioning of the reproductive systems, usually in your early teens. So, but before that, let's start with before that. Before puberty, the ovary is pretty simple. In it, if you look inside, the main thing you would see would be a couple 100,000 in each ovary primordial follicles. And that's it. All these other things you see here would not be there. Just the primordial follicles. Primordial means, very early. The beginning follicles. The earliest follicles. And I'm just going to draw you one down here. Very simple drawing of it. So inside the follicle would be the egg cell. I'm going to call it the egg, but actually it is not if you recall, eggs and sperm are produced by meiosis, because you want to have the number of chromosomes. So I'm calling this the egg, but it's not actually finished with meiosis yet. We'll talk more about that shortly. But it's in the process of going through meiosis. It's already even started meiosis in females. Not in males. Meiosis doesn't start till puberty, when the sperm start to be made. But in females, meiosis begins before birth, except that it doesn't get very far, and it stops, and it's like frozen all the way up until puberty, and maybe even beyond. And so it's frozen in an early stage of meiosis. So it's really a developing egg that's in there. Okay, and then around the egg would be a single layer of squamous epithelial cells. Just one layer. So these are epithelial cells. Okay, one egg and then a single layer of epithelial cells. And sometimes they're referred to as follicle cells. So that's the primordial follicle. It's the egg and the surrounding epithelial cells. It's a pretty simple structure, all frozen in early meiosis. So that's all you see. Starting at puberty, during and repeating from then on a more or less monthly cycle, the ovary is going, some, not all, but a few of these primordial follicles are going to undergo some changes. So some of those primordial follicles will start to develop into primary, and then first they'll become primary, then secondary follicles, and then not all of them, but usually just one of them ends up becoming the mature tertiary or Graafian follicle. So you start to see, again, starting at puberty, you start to see some of these other structures appear. And then the mature follicle is going to release its egg into the fallopian tube. That's what ovulation is. Release of the egg from the ovary. And then what's left of the follicle is going to become something called the corpus luteum. And that will be around for a little under 2 weeks. And we'll talk about all of these structures in more detail. That'll be around for 10 days, and then it'll start to degenerate, and then by the end of that month it's just basically some scar tissue called the corpus albicans. So this is just a quick overview, but my point here is that before birth you only see primordial follicles. Starting at puberty, so for many years, after birth, up until puberty, that's all there'd be. Then starting at puberty you start to see some of these other structures, and which ones you're going to see depends on what time of the ovarian cycle you look at. The sort of standard length of time of an ovarian cycle, where you see all these cyclic changes happen, is about 28 days, or we usually just say a month, the monthly cycle. So let's look at some of those follicles in more detail. So here's the primordial follicle. So you see the egg is huge. This is part of the egg too out here. This is the cytoplasm of the egg, and this is the egg's nucleus here. It's still it's still going through meiosis, so it hasn't finished yet, but it's in the process. So this is a huge cell, the egg cell. It's the biggest human cell there is, the egg cell. And then we see these this layer of follicle cells around it. Okay, and they're also showing you outside of that there'd be some connective tissue. See these stromal cells with collagen fibers. So that's your primordial follicle. Very simple. Of the ones that are chosen to develop further, here's a little more developed follicle called primary follicle. Notice the big change here is that the egg cell is surrounded by several layers of cells. Not just one. So these epithelial follicle cells have undergone mitosis, and they've formed several layers now. Okay, before I go on, I just want to back up for a moment and mention that the egg cell, it goes by many names. Primary oocyte is another name for the developing egg, just so you don't get confused. Okay, so back to the primary follicle. So it's got a thicker wall around it, but really nothing happened to the egg. It's still arrested in early meiosis. It didn't really change much. Here's a little bit later on in follicle development. This is, oh, whoops, went the wrong way. Okay, here's the next stage of follicle development where the primary follicle becomes a secondary follicle. Now, if you compare these two, the big difference is how you mainly know you've moved into the secondary follicle stage is that you start to see a cavity develop. You see a space in here, and there's fluid in there. This is the beginning of what they call the antrum, which is going to become huge in the mature follicle, but right now in the secondary follicle it's small. And you might even see a couple of them, little separate cavities within this wall of follicle cells. So that's the secondary follicle. Again, the egg, here called primary oocyte, is nothing's happened to it. It's just basically sitting there inside the follicle. And then here's a mature follicle, also called tertiary follicle or Graafian follicle. And notice that now the antrum is huge. This is all a cavity in here filled with what they call follicular fluid. And then notice the granulosa cells form, a ring around this big cavity, and they also form a ring or halo around the egg cell, which is called the corona radiata. So the corona radiata are the follicle cells that literally, the ones that go around, like a corona, or radiate around the egg. I want you to know those because when the egg gets ovulated, because that is the significance of the Graafian follicle, is that this is the egg that will be released that month from the ovary, and it's going to take the corona radiata with it when it goes. And this will be important when we, in our last lecture, when we talk about fertilization and what the sperm has to get through to fertilize the egg. It's going to have to get through the corona radiata. Okay, so this shows the four main stages of follicle development. Again, primordial, primary, secondary, and tertiary or mature or Graafian follicle. And this is just a close-up of the Graafian follicle. You might remember this from the endocrine system, because we did look at one of these Graafian or mature follicles, and at that time we were just focusing on the endocrine function of the Graafian follicle. So just to review that, recall that these cells here, called in the theca, what's called the theca interna, these cells that are the cells that make testosterone. And then the cells, the granulosa cells surrounding this antrum cavity, are the ones that convert that testosterone to estrogen. And in fact, the mature Graafian follicle makes lots and lots of estrogen that's going to enter the bloodstream of the female, and it would be detectable in their bloodstream. So, that is the endocrine function. I mean, in addition to housing the egg cell, the tertiary or mature follicle makes estrogen. Okay, now this complicated looking slide, mainly I wanted to show you this to give you an overview of the really the huge difference between meiosis in males and females in terms of the timing. I mean, in terms of what's actually going on, it's similar in that, in both cases you're starting with a cell that has 46 chromosomes in it. That's the diploid number for humans. And you want to end up with, so you've got a cell with 46 chromosomes, and you want to end up with cells that have 23 chromosomes in them. And in males, for every cell that undergoes meiosis, you get 4 cells with 23 chromosomes in it that become functional sperm. So that's in males. In females, on the other hand, for every cell that undergoes meiosis, you actually only get 1 functional egg cell. And the other 3 are tiny. They're called, and it's huge. Huge cell, the functional egg cell. But the other 3, which all have 23 chromosomes in it, but the other 3 are called polar bodies. And they're called that not because meiosis is different in males and females, but because cytokinesis is different. In females, remember, cytokinesis is the division of the rest of the cell in addition to the chromosomes. So it's basically, usually the cell, like in males, the cell will pinch in 2, and you get 2 equally sized daughter cells, and then each one of those will pinch in 2 to form 4 equally sized daughter cells that we see up here. But in females, cytokinesis is unequal, and when it occurs, one of the 2 daughter cells gets most of the cytoplasm and the organelles, and the other cell doesn't get much. That would be the first polar body, or that would be a polar body. And then each one of these cells will undergo meiosis 2, the second round, and in the end, here's what you get. 1 large functional egg cell. This is why egg cells are so huge. And then 3 tiny polar bodies. So see this polar body here? How much smaller it is than the egg cell? It's due to unequal cytokinesis. The reason for that, briefly, is that the egg has to provide more than just half the chromosomes, like the sperm is doing. The sperm is basically delivering the 23 chromosomes that are going to combine with the 23 chromosomes in the egg to form a new fertilized zygote or egg cell with 46 chromosomes. And you always get half your DNA from your mom and half from your dad, and not just any half, but one of each homologous chromosome from each parent. So the egg needs to be bigger because in addition to supplying 23 chromosomes, it's supplying organelles that the cell is going to need if it gets fertilized to start out with, to make proteins and to divide by mitosis, etc. And it's going to have stored nutrients in it until later on in pregnancy the placenta forms, which we'll talk about in our last lecture. But early on, the egg is providing the organelles and the nutrients. And, by the way, included in those organelles would be mitochondria, which, if you recall from general biology, mitochondria are unusual organelles in that they can divide on their own within a cell. They have some of their own DNA. They're thought to have been, in the past, independent, free-living organisms that became endosymbiotically incorporated into eukaryotic cells, and they now are one of our organelles. Anyway, you get your mitochondria always from your mother, whether you're male or female. The original mitochondria that you inherit when an egg and sperm fertilize always come from the mother. Sometimes I use that for genealogy purposes. Since the mitochondria have DNA in them, you know that came from the mother side of your family. Anyway, back to meiosis and comparing males and females. So this is one difference, is the actual number of functional gametes you get. 4 per cell that undergoes meiosis in males, but only 1 in females. Only 1 functional cell. The polar bodies cannot be fertilized by sperm and become a successful pregnancy. They're not viable, as we say. Okay, so that's one big difference. And then the other big difference is in the timing. It's in males, it's pretty straightforward. Starting at puberty, cells in the seminiferous tubules of the testes start to undergo meiosis. And that will continue pretty much for the life of the male as long as they're healthy. It tends to decline with age, but for the most part, there can be some meiosis going on from puberty onwards. Okay, in females it's very different. First of all, it starts in puberty just like in males, the functioning of the reproductive system. But remember I mentioned that meiosis actually starts even before that in the fetal period. So big difference here. So meiosis begins when the very early on in development, before birth. But notice it doesn't get very far. So this egg cell, or developing egg cell, is arrested in prophase 1. You might recall that's the very first phase of meiosis. When the homologous chromosomes line up, you get crossing over, and the spindle forms, and so on. So, you know, they don't get very far, but they're just like frozen there, or as they say, arrested. In males, you know, it's going to be many, many years later that meiosis begins. Once again, not until puberty. But here it's before birth. It happens in every single egg. So at birth, you know, at the time of birth, these developing egg cells are all going to be in primordial follicles. Okay, now here's another thing that's different, is that in males, once meiosis begins, it's pretty much of a continuous process. It's not as fast as you might think. It can take days or even several weeks for stem cells to go all the way through meiosis. But still, it's, you know, a continuous process. In females, there's lots of starting and stopping. So we already looked at one place where it began and then was arrested. And then the next time the egg cell is going to resume meiosis is really not going to be unless and until that egg cell is ends up in a mature Graafian follicle. If it doesn't, it will have never gotten past this phase, prophase 1. But if it is in that big Graafian follicle, then it is going to, right before it's ovulated in the fallopian tube, it's going to complete meiosis 1, and it's going to sort of begin meiosis 2, and it will be ovulated in that, rested in that stage, in metaphase 2. So, only in the Graafian follicle eggs does meiosis ever continue on from that very early beginnings of meiosis, back before birth. Okay, so this is only going to start at puberty, when, you know, there's a possibility that an egg cell could end up in a tertiary Graafian follicle. Now, even this cell right here that's being ovulated in the fallopian tube, even it is not finished with meiosis. And in fact, it never will unless it is fertilized by sperm. So fertilization is actually required for the completion of the second phase of meiosis, meiosis 2. So in overall, notice the very different timing here. And really, for most egg cells, they will never, ever get completely through meiosis. Only those that are fertilized ever finish meiosis. Okay, so once the egg gets released into the fallopian tube, or here's that other term I was mentioning, oviducts or uterine tube, take your pick, they're going to be moved along the egg cell by cilia and by a rhythmic smooth muscle contraction in the fallopian tube. We use the term peristalsis just like we use in the urinary and digestive system. And I mentioned before those fimbriae that are going to help sweep the oocyte or the egg or developing egg into the fallopian tube. Okay, now meanwhile, so the egg's in the fallopian tube. Meanwhile, if that egg wants to get fertilized or is to be fertilized, then sperm need to reach the fallopian tube within 24 hours after the egg is ovulated. That's all the egg has before it will degenerate and cannot be fertilized by a sperm anymore. So we say that eggs are viable for 24 hours after ovulation. That's it. So, again, if that egg has a chance of being fertilized, then within that 24 hours there needs to be sperm reaching the fallopian tube to fertilize it. We'll be looking at that in our last lecture, where we will talk about fertilization and where we will talk about how, unlike the egg, which only has 24 hours, once it's released, sperm can live 2 or 3 days in the female reproductive system before they are no longer capable of fertilizing the egg. So we'll put those two together later and talk about how many days during a particular month can intercourse lead to fertilization of an egg. Okay, so more on that later. If that egg does get fertilized, like I say, it's usually in the fallopian tube, so that is one of the functions of the fallopian tube. It is the site for the normal site for fertilization. And if it does get fertilized, we call it a zygote. So zygote is just another name for the fertilized egg cell. And notice that it takes a while for it to get to the uterus. It takes almost a week. So it's not like it zips down like it's going down a slide or something. It's like slowly rolled around. And again, as we'll see in our last lecture, it's going to start developing as it moves towards the uterus. So by the time it gets there, it's not just a single cell anymore. But that's another lecture. So this is just to remind you what the fimbriae look like. So the fimbriae start to move and sweep across the surface of the ovary around the time of ovulation, and the egg then hopefully gets sucked up into the fallopian tube. If not, it's going to go into the peritoneal cavity. Okay, so we're going to talk more about the ovary. We're not finished with it yet, but I did want to take a short diversion here and talk about the other major organ of the female we're going to be talking about, which is the uterus. So here we see the uterus. So the fallopian tubes are leading into it. This would be the lumen in here of the uterus. And here we see the wall of the uterus. It's quite thick. It's got different layers. And the innermost layer lining the lumen is called the endometrium. The endometrium. So that's the layer that faces the lumen. And that is especially the layer we're going to be focusing on, because just like the ovary goes through cycles of changes starting at puberty, so does the uterus. It's also going to undergo changes during that same 28-day cycle. In the uterus, we call it the uterine cycle or the menstrual cycle. And the main thing that's going to happen during that is that the part of the endometrium, the part that's right next to the lumen, which is called the functional layer, that part is going to get thicker during part of the cycle, and then it's going to slough off during another part, meaning the cells are going to die and then slough off into the lumen. So it's going to get thicker and thinner throughout the menstrual or uterine cycle. Now there is a part of the endometrium that never changes. That's the basal layer, or the stratum basalis down here. So that part's not going to get thicker and thinner, but the part of it is. This is just a list of the 3 layers. The endometrium with those 2 sublayers I was talking about, functionalis, that builds up and then is shed during the menstrual part of the uterine cycle, and then the basal layer that's always there and can give rise to another functional layer. Outside of that's the myometrium. Hopefully by now that should be clear. You should immediately think of muscle. It's a smooth muscle layer, quite thick. These are the smooth muscles that contract during childbirth. And then on the outside is a visceral peritoneum, also called the perimetrium. This is a serous membrane, so very thin for lubrication. So there's 2 cycles we're going to be looking at, or we've already started with the ovary, but the ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle. They are tied. In other words, what happens in the ovary dictates what happens in the uterus. So they're tied together. And to remind you, so we studied this already, these are the 2 main hormones that guide these changes. FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, which does just what the name implies. It stimulates follicle development from primordial to primary to secondary to mature tertiary Graafian follicles. And then LH is needed for another structure in the ovary that I haven't talked about yet, called the corpus luteum, that you see in the second part of the cycle, the last 2 weeks of the 4-week cycle. And LH is the main hormone for that period because it stimulates the formation and the maintenance of something called the corpus luteum, which makes these 2 hormones, estrogen and progesterone. So LH stands for luteinizing hormone because it's needed for the corpus luteum. Okay, and again, we haven't talked about the corpus luteum yet, but we will. So also recall from the endocrine system that both of these hormones have the same releasing hormone that controls them from the hypothalamus, the gonadotrophin releasing hormone. So you release that, goes to your pituitary, and stimulates FSH and LH. And so just that's a reminder of the 2 main hormones driving the ovarian and uterine, especially the ovarian cycle. Okay, now the next thing I'm about to tell you is not in your book, but I personally think it's helpful to use these 2 terms, recruitment and selection, when talking about the events that occur in the first half of the ovarian cycle, when the follicles are getting, some of them, not most of them, but some of them are going to develop. So, you will see these terms on your objective sheet, recruitment and selection, to describe them. What do these terms mean, and what would you see in the ovary during the recruitment and selection phase? So basically, recruitment is what happens at the beginning of let's say a 28-day ovarian cycle. So at the beginning of the cycle, the main hormone behind recruitment is FSH. So the pituitary needs to release FSH. It goes to the ovary, and it recruits several primordial follicles. And I don't know the exact number, but we're talking maybe 100, or not all of them, certainly not. Just a small percent of the primordial follicles will bind with this follicle stimulating hormone and develop into primary follicles and then into secondary follicles. So recruitment is the phase when, under the influence of FSH, some primordial follicles become secondary follicles. Okay, First they'll become primary, then secondary follicles. So again, you have to have FSH drives this. Or you could say GnRH since it's controlling FSH. Okay, one more thing about recruitment is that by the end of the recruitment phase, when you have secondary follicles, these follicles start to make estrogen. We use E for estrogen. Remember, that's a steroid hormone made from cholesterol. Okay, so primary and primordial follicles do not make it, but secondary follicles, those epithelial cells, can start to synthesize estrogen. So if you were looking in the bloodstream of the female or monitoring estrogen levels, you would see estrogen levels start to rise during this part of the ovarian cycle. But before that, in the very early days of it, there would be no estrogen made. Okay, so that's recruitment. So first you're going to recruit some primordial follicles to become secondary follicles. And then of those secondary follicles, usually just one, sometimes more, but usually just one becomes the, oops, I have this in the wrong place. That should be over here. Becomes the Graafian or tertiary follicle. Okay, so what I'm saying is that let's say you have 50 secondary follicles. What I'm saying is that just one of those usually becomes the tertiary follicle. Sometimes two. I mean, this is how people have twins or triplets, 3. Women who take fertility drugs, you know, sometimes you hear about them having octuplets or multiple births. And part of it is that if you use hormone therapy, you might get more than the usual one Graafian follicle to increase the chances of pregnancy. So for people having fertility issues. But anyway, normally there's just one tertiary follicle that develops. And again, I apologize, but this should go over here. Tertiary follicle is the Graafian follicle. What happens to the other secondary follicles? Well, sort of a sad story, but the rest of the secondary follicles die off. They undergo what's called atresia. So they just degenerate. But, you know, until they do, they did contribute by making estrogen. Because remember, they do have an endocrine function. But then they undergo atresia. The tertiary follicle also makes estrogen. So there's a lot of estrogen after the selection, or during and at the end of the selection phase. Okay, so we call it selection because we're selecting one of the secondary follicles to become the tertiary follicle. So recruitment and selection. Now this is one of my favorite pictures of showing both the ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle in the same picture. This is from an older edition, so in your book it might look a little different, but I prefer this one. I like the way it's kind of neatly lined up, where you see what's going on in the uterus during the various phases of the ovarian cycle, and also they give you a timeline down here. So it's going from day 1 to day 28. You know, that's a cycle period for the ovarian and the menstrual or uterine cycles. So let's go back to the ovarian cycle and review what we've already covered, and then talk about the second half, which we haven't said much about. Oh, and up here also they're reminding you about the hormones driving this. GnRH, stimulating FSH and LH, and then those go to the ovary and drive the ovarian cycle. Okay, so as we just went over, at the beginning of the ovarian cycle, there's only primordial follicles, and they're really not doing any, they're not making any hormones. There's nothing happening in the egg, they're just sort of there. And then under the influence of FSH, you're going to get recruitment. Recruitment of some, just a few, of the primordial follicles into primary and then secondary follicles. And when you have secondary follicles, that's when you're going to see estrogen levels go up, or start to go up. So estrogen levels will start to rise from this point on. Then you're going to get selection of one of the secondary follicles to form the mature follicle. It also makes estrogen. That's why you have arrows coming from both here. So lots of estrogen now in the ovary. Okay, now that this whole phase that we just talked about, going from primordial to mature follicles, is referred to as the follicular phase, which makes sense, right? Follicular phase, the phase during which follicles are developing under follicle stimulating hormones influence. Okay, if we look down here, we see that we're around day 11 into the cycle. Okay, so for the next 4 days in the ovary, you've got this mature follicle cranking out lots and lots of estrogen. So estrogen levels are really shooting up. And the follicular phase culminates with ovulation. So ovulation occurs about halfway through the ovarian cycle. So in this idealized timeline of day 14. Here we see the egg along with the corona radiata being expelled from the Graafian follicle. Expelled where? Into the fallopian tube, where it might get fertilized. Okay, so that's ovulation, and that marks the end of the follicular phase. By the way, don't be confused if you're using a different book. Sometimes they call day 11 to 14 the ovulatory phase. It's, you know, the later part of the follicular phase. So you can divide it up into various ways, but the ovulatory phase is the late follicular phase, part of the follicular phase. Okay, now what happens to this egg will be in our last lecture, but let's look at what's left of the Graafian follicle. All these other cells left behind with the antrum and the granulose cells and a bunch of thecal cells, like what happens to them? Well, this is where LH comes into play. LH is the more important hormone in the what they call luteal phase of the ovarian cycle, and they call it that because the predominant structure present is the corpus luteum, which means corpus means body and luteum means yellow body. And really the corpus luteum is the old Graafian follicle minus the egg and corona radiata. It is those cells transformed into the corpus luteum, and you have to have LH for this, luteinizing hormone. So let me say that again. Luteinizing hormone, LH, transforms what's left of the Graafian follicle after ovulation into the corpus luteum. It is kind of yellowish because there's a lot of, it's going to make lots of steroid hormones from cholesterol. In fact, it's going to make estrogen just like the secondary and tertiary follicle did, but it's also going to make progesterone. Notice I never mentioned progesterone in the follicular phase because nobody makes it there. Only the corpus luteum. The Graafian follicle does not. It makes estrogen only. So now we've got progesterone and estrogen being secreted from the ovary. And as long as you have LH to support it, the corpus luteum will crank out lots of those two hormones. But towards the end of the luteal phase, getting up around day 27, a couple days before the end of that cycle, the LH levels start to drop. This is all controlled by the hypothalamus, by the brain. The LH levels start to drop, and without that support of LH, the corpus luteum starts to degenerate, starts to get smaller and smaller and smaller until really it's just a scar remnant of what it used to be the corpus luteum. We now call it the white body. Albicans means white. Corpus body, white body. It has no function anymore. It's just what's left of the corpus luteum. Okay, so that marks the end of the ovarian cycle. So those are all the complex changes that go on in the ovary Now, to get a handle on why the ovary is so complicated and making like estrogen sometimes and progesterone, estrone others, we need to look at the menstrual or uterine cycle that is driven by the estrogen and the progesterone made in the ovary. So what I'm saying is that the hormones made in the ovary are what bring about the changes that you see in the endometrium of the uterus. So let's look at the uterus now down here. So just to orient you, this picture down here of the uterus is really, it's only showing you the endometrium, not the myometrium would be down here and the perimetrium out there. So we're just looking at the endometrium, and the darker orange layer, that's the basalis layer that doesn't change. But the functional layer, look how it gets thicker and thinner throughout the course of the cycle. Okay, and what's driving that? Hormones from the ovary. So let's start. So I'm going to go through the uterine cycle next. And for me, it's easier to explain if I start on day 4. So if we could just start there, and then I'll come back to the first 4 days at the end. So if we look on day 4 of the cycles of what's going on in the ovary, because these are corresponding here. If you look at what's going on in the ovary around day 4, that's when you first start to see secondary follicles appear, and they're making estrogen. That estrogen goes into the bloodstream, it's carried all throughout the body, and as we learn with the endocrine system, if you have receptors for it, then you can be a target cell. And one of the main, not only, but one of the main target cells for estrogen are these endometrial cells. So estrogen binds to them, and what does it cause? It stimulates them to divide by mitosis. So you start to see the endometrium getting thicker and thicker. See how much thicker the light part's getting? We call that the proliferative phase. Proliferation just means grow. Sometimes they also call it the estrogen dominant phase, because you must have estrogen from the ovary for the proliferative phase to happen. No estrogen, the functional layer is just going to stay real thin. But to get it to proliferate, the ovary has to secrete estrogen. And it can't do that unless your pituitary makes FSH to stimulate those follicles. Because remember, primordial and primary follicles cannot make estrogen, just secondary and mature. Okay, so that's the proliferative phase. So it corresponds to the later part of the follicular phase all the way up to ovulation. So in other words, not the early follicular phase when there's no hormone, but getting into day 4 or 5 of the follicular phase all the way up to the point of ovulation on day 14 is the proliferative phase. These are epithelial cells here, and then there's some connective tissue underneath, and they're just growing, getting thicker. And also notice there's some pretty extensive blood vessel growth up into to that functional layer. So it's very vascular. Okay, now on day 14, the egg gets ovulated, and as we talked about, what's left of the Graafian follicle becomes the corpus luteum, which now adds progesterone into the mix along with estrogen. So with the appearance of progesterone, the uterus enters what's called the secretory phase. And it's called that because these epithelial cells here that dip down and form these pits, sort of like you saw in the stomach, remember the gastric pits that were lined with gastric glands. These epithelial cells are secreting products into the lumen, like nutrients, for example, into the lumen of the uterus. So they are glands. They are glands that are secreting, but they can only do it if there's progesterone around. So that's the secretory phase. This built-up layer now has glands secreting products like nutrients into the lumen of the uterus. Okay, and as long as the corpus luteum is around, the uterus will be in this secretory phase. But let's look at what happens when LH levels drop and the corpus luteum is no longer supported, and estrogen and progesterone levels start to drop down. Without those hormones to support it, the endometrium cannot stay in the secretory phase. And all these cells in here that built up over the course of the proliferative and now secretory phase are going to die off and slough off, meaning they're going to go into the lumen of the uterus, and then and there's going to be a lot of blood that goes with it because these blood vessels are going to spasm, and you get a sloughing off of this built up endometrium plus blood into the lumen of the uterus, as I said, and then down through the cervix and out the vagina. So that begins the menstrual phase. So the menstrual phase is the sloughing off of the built up endometrium along with quite a bit of blood, and that's because you don't have this hormone support anymore. So it starts to slough off, and that will continue on into the first few days of the next ovarian cycle. So if we go back here to the part I skipped, days 1 through 4, notice the endometrium is sloughing off. So that would be the sloughing off from the previous cycle where the endometrium, I mean, as long as this isn't the first, cycle, but assuming this is like there was a prior cycle, the uterus endometrium would have been built up, and then it's sloughing off from the previous cycle. So the menstrual, that's called the menstrual phase. So it corresponds to the very end of the follicular, the very end of the secretory phase, and then it extends on into the beginning early follicular phase of the next cycle. So to summarize, the uterine cycle has 3 phases: the menstrual, proliferative, and the secretory. And make sure you understand which hormones are needed for those. Proliferative is only estrogen, secretory is estrogen and progesterone, and the menstrual phase is no hormones. There are no estrogen, no progesterone, neither one. Okay, so coming back to this picture again then, back to just the ovarian cycle. So now you're in a better position to understand what this part is. So here's the corpus luteum that's formed from the graphene follicle after ovulation. This shows when the LH levels start to drop. See how it's shriveling up, and then in the end it's just that scar remnant. Okay, so I might be asking you questions. For example, let's go back to this. I might ask you something along the lines of when the uterus is in the secretory phase, what structures are you going to see in the ovarian cycle, in the ovary? So you'd say, well, the secretory phase in the uterus corresponds to the luteal phase in the ovary, so you're going to see a corpus luteum. What are you going to see in the proliferative phase in the ovary? When the uterus is in the proliferative phase, you're going to see secondary, and then a little later on the mature follicles. What are you going to see during the menstrual phase? You're going to see primordial and primary follicles. Also, depending on when you're looking at, initially you're going to see corpus albicans, and there will be primordial follicles. So, a couple more things before we finish up. I just want to show you this graph mainly to show you this right here, that ovulation, which occurs around day 14 or maybe a little bit before, is triggered by a surge of LH. FSH, there's also going to be a bump in that because they're controlled by the same releasing hormone, but you see especially a spike in LH. They call this the LH surge. So that is necessary for ovulation to occur. So that's sort of how the egg knows when to leave the graphene follicle, when this LH surge occurs. Okay, and here we see the egg, being released. And again, we're going to pick up from this in our last lecture and follow it through the fallopian tube. Alright, and here's just a photograph of a secondary oocyte. That's the egg that's going to be ovulated. And then this is my last slide. This is similar to the previous slide I was showing you, where they show you what's going on in the ovary and also what's going on in the uterus at the same time. So it's just a slightly different presentation of that information. If this one is a little easier for you to follow, I like the previous although I've marked it all up, but this one I like a little better, I think, because it has the timeline, but they convey basically the same information. So that is the conclusion of our lecture on the female reproductive system, which you see is far more complicated than the male, and that is, and I apologize, but I just remembered something I meant to add in, so if I could go back here for a moment. I did mean to add two things. One is I wanted to address why. Why is the uterus going through all these different changes? Why doesn't it just stay in the secretory phase, or in the proliferative phase, and so on? So I did want to address that, and that is the reason for this is that, well, first of all, the secretory phase is very expensive in terms of these glands are secreting lots of good nutrients into the lumen of the uterus. So a female would not be wanting to do this constantly. It's just wasteful and expensive. You only want the uterus to be in the secretory phase when there's a chance that the egg that got ovulated during that cycle might have gotten fertilized, and if it did, when it gets to the uterus a week later, that uterus better be in the secretory phase or the pregnancy won't be successful. So we'll talk more about this in the next lecture, but the secretory phase is mandatory for the developing zygote when it gets there, because by then it will have used up its stored nutrients in the egg, and it's going to need those nutrients that are supplied by these glands. So it's all timed precisely so that the uterus is in the secretory phase soon after ovulation. But if the uterus is in the early follicular phase or anytime before ovulation, there's no reason to keep the uterus in this secretory phase. So that built-up secretory phase is going to be sloughed off until there's another chance that a fertilized egg may arrive. So that's the main reason for the uterine cycle, is that it's just too expensive to keep the uterus in that secretory phase all the time, when there's really only a few days in each cycle when a developing zygote might arrive. Okay, and then the last thing I've wanted to mention is that in females, the ovarian and uterine cycle do not continue throughout the life of the healthy female. They end at what's called menopause, usually in a woman's 50s. That's when the ovary stops going through these cyclic changes and you stop having the uterine cycle. And this ties back to the additional function of the female reproductive system. It's providing a site for pregnancy. So as women get older, into their 60s or 70s, then they are not releasing eggs that could be that could lead to pregnancy. So that's another big difference between males and females. And that is the end of this lecture on the female reproductive system.